Are you confused by Aseprite's layer modes because you've been playing around with them but you struggle with understanding what is actually happening on your screen when you use them? Well, I certainly was. And that's why I started investigating what is actually going on with those layer modes and how we can use them effectively for our pixel art. You can find the list of all available layer modes by right-clicking on a layer and selecting Properties, or by simply pressing F2 on your keyboard. By the way, I'm working with Aseprite version 1.3.11, so if you're watching this at a later point in time, maybe the developers have added even more layer modes. But currently this is what we can work with, and it is already quite a long list. So the first thing you notice is that this list is subdivided into groups. And this is not a coincidence, because each of those groups has a particular meaning, which will help you with deciding which layer mode to choose, depending on the effect that you would like to achieve. From top to bottom, the groups are Normal, Darken, Lighten, Contrast, Inversion, and Component. The Normal group in Aseprite currently only contains one layer mode, also called Normal. And this is the default layer mode that is active when you create a new layer. By the way, those groups and the layer modes they contain are actually not specific to Aseprite. In fact, other popular image editing software such as Photoshop or GIMP offer the same layer modes, actually even more of them, and there the layer modes are sometimes also called blend modes or blending modes. Because this is essentially what they do. They take two or more layers and blend them together in a specific way. But how does this work exactly? A layer mode looks at each pixel in the layer it is assigned to, and it modifies the appearance of that pixel based on the pixels in the same location in the layers below. In order for a layer mode to have a visible effect, we therefore need at least two layers, because for a single layer there's no other pixel information below, and nothing will happen to the pixels in that case. So let's say we do have two layers. Let's call the bottom layer the base layer and the top layer the blend layer. The base layer contains our pixel art image in its original form. The blend layer contains pixels that will determine how the final image will look like when we activate one of the layer modes on that blend layer. One good thing about layer modes is that they don't actually change the pixel information in any of the layers, but they just show the result of the blending operation to the user. This way, the original pixel data stays intact in all of the layers. In other words, a layer mode is a non-destructive operation and very easy to switch on or off during your workflow. In fact, some of the modes are usually not used to change the final appearance of your image, but more as helper tools that you can switch on or off during the creation of your pixel art. But let's quickly go through the list of layer mode groups and what they do exactly. The default layer mode Normal is very simple. It just shows the pixels of the blend layer, no matter what pixel information is in the layers below. Unless, of course, there are transparent pixels in your blend layer or you are reducing the opacity of the blend layer to something smaller than 100%. The next group of layer modes is called Darken, because all the modes in that group will make your original pixel image darker in some kind of way, depending on the exact algorithm behind the layer mode that you choose. Note that the modes are sorted by strength of the darkening effect. So Darken has the weakest darkening effect, Multiply has a stronger darkening effect, and Color Burn has the strongest darkening effect of the three. Similarly, all the layer modes in the Lighten group will make your image lighter in some kind of way. Again, they are sorted by the strength of that effect. Lighten is the weakest, and Addition is the strongest lighten effect in the group. The layer modes in the Contrast group do both at the same time. Pixels that are darker than 50% gray will be darkened, while pixels that are lighter than 50% gray will be lightened. And pixels that are exactly 50% gray will become transparent. The layer modes in the Inversion group blend the layers based on the difference between the two layers. And the layers in the Component group blend the layers based on the hue, saturation, or luminosity components of the pixels. So let's dive into each layer mode in more detail, starting with the ones in the Darken group. In our example, we have this image as our base layer and we have this image as our blend layer. What you can see here are 11 shades of gray, starting with 100% black on the left, then going up by 10% brightness in each step, with 50% gray in the center, and finally 100% white on the right. All three layer modes in the Darken category show a similar pattern when we apply them to that blend layer. 100% black will stay 100% black, 100% white will become fully transparent, and all shades of gray in between are semi-transparent depending on how far away they are from black or white on that spectrum. Also, any shade of gray that is darker than 100% white has a darkening effect on the pixels in the base layer below. Hence the category name Darken. The way how this darkening effect works exactly then depends on the layer mode that you select. The first mode, named also Darken, performs the most simple calculation of the three. For each pixel in the blend layer, it compares the R, G and B components of that pixel with the R, G and B components of the pixel in the base layer. And it then shows as a result a new color that consists of all the smaller R, G and B components of that comparison. This explains why 100% black stays 100% black, because no matter what the other pixel in the base layer looks like, it can never be darker than black. At the same time, a pixel is never lighter than 100% white, so when comparing the RGB values of a pixel in the base layer with 100% white, the pixel in the base layer always wins, so to speak. Which is why the 100% white color in the blend layer disappears, or in other words, it becomes fully transparent. But what happens if we blend colors other than shades of gray with our base layer? Let's look, for example, at the three main colors of the RGB color model, so pure red, pure green and pure blue. When we blend that layer with our base layer, we get this result. What we see here is that for the red area, the R component of the pixel in our base layer always wins the comparison against the pure red in our blend layer. So the resulting color takes the R component from the pixel in our base layer. At the same time, the other two components are zero in our blend layer. So no matter what green or blue components that pixel in the base layer has, the resulting green and blue components will both be zero. And this is why in the red area we see different shades of red with no green or no blue mixed in. And the same holds for the other two areas, which show different shades of green or different shades of blue respectively. So now that you have an idea of how the Darken layer mode works, we can very easily explain the Lighten layer mode too, because what Lighten does is the exact opposite of Darken. It also compares the R, G and B components of the pixels and creates a new color, but this time it takes the larger R, G and B components of that comparison. So the result when blending our gray values against the base layer is this. Now black becomes completely transparent because black can never be lighter than the other pixel we compare it against. At the same time, white remains a solid color in the result because it always wins the lightness comparison against any other pixel in our base layer. And this is what we see when we blend the RGB color layer against our base layer. This time we see all the original colors of our base layer, but with the R, G and B components turned up to its maximum in the three areas respectively. So as we have just seen, Lighten is the opposite layer mode of Darken. In fact, the other layer modes in the Darken category are also the opposite layer modes of the corresponding ones in the Lighten category. So Multiply is the opposite of Screen and Color Burn is the opposite of Color Dodge. Addition was added later to the Lighten group and has no corresponding layer mode in the Darken group at the time of recording this video. So what do Multiply and Screen do? Multiply looks at the R, G and B components of the pixels in the blend layer and the base layer and it multiplies them. Note that Aseprite displays the RGB values in the range from 0 to 255, but the multiplication is actually done with the RGB values mapped to the range from 0 to 1, because otherwise you might end up with values outside that valid range. Just like Darken, the result of Multiply shows black as solid black, while white becomes transparent. This is because black has 0 in all three RGB components, and multiplying 0 with any number stays 0. At the same time, white has a 1 in all three components, and multiplying 1 with any other number does not change that number. And as you would expect, since Multiply is also part of the Darken group, it creates darker pixels when blending our different shades of gray against our base layer. For our color blend layer with pure red, green and blue, we see the exact same result as for the Darken layer mode because we are multiplying the pixels of our base layer with either 1 or 0. But in general, we do see differences between the Darken and the Multiply layer modes when we use a blend layer that has colors other than the pure base colors. While Darken tends to replace details of your base layer with a solid darker color, Multiply tends to still keep all the details in your base layer but also produces a darker result. So what does Screen do? Screen, being the opposite of Multiply, has this effect when we blend our shades of gray against the base layer. Black becomes transparent, white stays 100% white, and all shades in between result in lighter versions of the pixels on our base layer. This is because screen works similarly to multiply, but it works with the inverted RGB components of the pixels. Inverting a number between 0 and 1 means that we take 1 minus that number. What screen does exactly for each RGB component is that it inverts the component of the pixels in the blend and the base layers, then multiplies them, and then inverts the resulting value again. Just like with multiply and darken, the result of screen and lighten is the same when we apply that blend mode to our RGB color blend layer, because we multiply either with an inverted 0, which is 1, or with an inverted 1, which is 0. But again, in general, screen and lighten give different results when we use it with colors other than pure red, green or blue. While lighten tends to replace details of your base layer with a solid lighter color, screen tends to still keep all the details in your base layer but also produces a lighter result. The next pair in the list is color burn in the darken group and color dodge in the lighten group. Color burn takes each RGB component of the pixel in the base layer, inverts it, then divides it by the RGB component of the pixel in the blend layer, and then inverts the result. Just like the other two modes in the darken group, using color burn on our grayscale blend layer keeps black as black, white becomes transparent, and for the rest it produces even darker results than multiply. Actually, black means 0, and to avoid dividing by 0 it actually just returns 0. That's why you see black as black. Color dodge works the same way but with all involved values inverted compared to color burn. It takes the RGB components of each pixel in the base layer and then divides it by the inverted RGB components of the pixel in the blend layer. This way, black becomes transparent, white stays 100% white, and for the rest it produces even lighter results than the screen layer mode. The last mode in the darken group, called addition, is again very simple. It takes the RGB components of each pixel in the blend layer and adds it to the RGB components of each pixel in the base layer. Of course, this can result in values larger than 255. In which case the result is capped at 255. Again, pure white stays white and black becomes transparent, just like with the other modes in the lighten group. As you would expect, addition has a strong lighten effect and often results in colors close to white. This might be useful if you want to, for example, create emission textures for your pixel art game. So now you know what the layer modes in the lighten and the darken categories do, and you can start experimenting with those layer modes whenever you need the entire image to become lighter or darker. For example, you can quickly create a shift from nighttime to daytime in a scene like this, by having a copy of your base layer as the blend layer and then applying color dodge, screen and addition in that order. Of course, you would also want to change the colors and patterns in the sky, but for having a quick result and an impression of how such a day-night cycle could look like, those layer modes are great to experiment with. But what if you want to have a combination of lighten and darken in your image? Well, this is exactly what the next group of layer modes, the contrast group, is for. All three layer modes in that group, overlay, soft light and hard light, produce a combination of the darken and lighting layer mode depending on the brightness value of the pixels. If you want to check the brightness value of a pixel in your image, you can select its color, click here, and switch from the RGB tab to the HSV tab, which shows the color as hue, saturation and value. That third component, value, is the brightness value between 0 and 100 that you are looking for. This value determines the effect that the overlay, soft light or hard light layer modes produce. Note that overlay looks at the brightness value of each pixel in the base layer, while soft light and hard light look at the pixel values in the blend layer. For all three layer modes, if the brightness is below 50, the pixel in the other layer will become darker. If the brightness is above 50, the pixel in the other layer will become lighter. If a pixel is exactly 50% gray, which means the brightness is 50 and also its saturation is 0, then the pixel in the other layer will be unaffected, or in other words, that 50% gray pixel will become transparent in the result. Overlay does this by applying the multiply layer mode at half strength for pixels in the base layer darker than 50%, and by applying the screen layer mode at half strength for the pixels in the base layer lighter than 50%. Closely related to overlay is hard light. Hard light has actually more in common with overlay than with soft light, even though you would not expect that from their names. Because what hard light does is the same as overlay, with the only difference that it looks at the brightness value of each pixel in the blend layer. while overlay looks at the brightness of the pixel in the base layer. The rest is the same. Hardlight applies a multiply blend at half strength for pixels darker than 50% and a screen blend at half strength for pixels lighter than 50%. Because of that relationship between overlay and hardlight, they are sometimes also called commuted blending modes. And this also means that when you apply overlay to the blend layer, you get the exact same result as if you applied hardlight to the base layer and then reverse the order of the two layers. So what about soft light then? Soft light is actually implemented differently depending on which software you use. By looking at the implementation in Aseprite, I found that the formula used in Aseprite produces results that are close to the results in Photoshop. Both produce a linear interpolation between 3 gamma corrections of the base layer image, depending on the pixel values in the blend layer. Aseprite has some subtle differences that improve upon this effect. But let's not get too deep into the math here and just say that soft light can be seen as a more subtle version of overlay. It also has a darkening or lightening effect depending on the brightness of the pixels, but it produces a much softer effect. Hence the name soft light. So now we have covered all layer modes in the first 4 categories, and we will talk about the remaining 2 categories in a bit. But first, if you find the information in this video useful, then please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more Aseprite tutorials and general pixel art content in the future. Thank you so much guys, it really helps the channel a lot. Now, the layer modes in the inversion group blend the layers based on the difference between the 2 layers. The first one is also called difference, and it simply takes the RGB values of both pixels and subtracts the smaller from the bigger value. This way it produces a new color that consists of the difference in each RGB component of the pixels, hence the name. Difference has no effect on pixels blended against black, and pixels blended against white become inverted. Blending an image against a copy of itself results in a completely black image, as we subtract a pixel from itself, resulting in 0 everywhere. If you move the copy of your base image by a few pixels and then use difference, you can get an interesting effect like this, which you might find useful for some special effects in your pixel art project. But in general, this layer mode is more useful as a tool to quickly identify unwanted differences between 2 layers that are supposed to have the same content. You can use it to verify that indeed the content you expect to be the same becomes black when applying difference. If not, you see that there are unwanted differences between the layers, and you might want to fix that. Next in the list is Exclusion. This mode adds the RGB components of the pixels and subtracts 2 times the result of multiplying them. The effect that this produces can be seen as the difference layer mode with much less contrast. You can see that difference and exclusion both have no effect when blending a pixel against black, and they both invert a pixel when blending against white, but they act differently when blending against 50% gray. Exclusion in this case produces a solid 50% gray color. The subtract layer mode takes the RGB components of the base layer and subtracts the RGB components of the blend layer. If this results in values lower than 0, it will return 0, so you can expect to see a lot of black color in your results. You can also see that blending a pixel against black has no effect because we subtract 0 from that pixel, and therefore we keep it unchanged. The divide layer mode divides the RGB components of the pixel in the base layer with the ones in the blend layer. This mode is useful for brightening your overall pixel art image if you blend it against a layer with a solid gray color. But you can also use that layer mode to regulate the color tints in your image. For example, if I felt that this image had too much green and I wanted to give it instead a more reddish tone to simulate a sunset in the evening, I can use a desaturated green tone as my blend layer and apply divide to get this effect. And now let's check the last group of layer modes, the component group, or HSL component group, because all those modes work with the hue, saturation or luminosity values of the pixels. You can inspect the HSL values of a selected color by clicking here and switching to the HSL tab. Here you find the hue, saturation and lightness components, and those 3 components are taken into consideration for all 4 layer modes in that last category. All 4 of them work based on the same principle. The name of the layer mode indicates which components of the pixels in your blend layer are used, while preserving the other components of the pixels in your base layer. So that means that the layer mode hue creates pixels that consist of the hue value found in the blend layer, but the saturation and lightness of the base layer. So if you want to change some hues in your image to, for example, red, green or blue, while keeping the saturation and lightness of your image unchanged, this is the layer mode to go for. Similarly, saturation creates pixels that consist of the saturation found in the blend layer and the hue and lightness found in the base layer. So if you want to change the saturation in your image without changing hue or lightness, then try this layer mode. The next mode, color, creates pixels that consist of the hue and saturation found in the blend layer and the lightness found in the base layer. One useful application of this mode is to create a layer with a gray tone, with which you can then switch grayscale mode on or off by showing or hiding that layer. The luminosity mode creates pixels that consist of the luminosity or lightness found in the blend layer and the hue and saturation found in the base layer. If you would like to see how I use the color layer mode together with the opacity settings in one of my pixel art scenes to create some atmospheric lighting effects, then you can check out this video next.